The snowstorm had been raging for 3 days. Sam looked out his window at the white world outside, watching as his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Parker, tried to clear her driveway. She was 80 years old and lived alone since her husband passed away last year. Sam grabbed his coat and boots. "Mom," he called out, "I'm gonna help Mrs. Parker." "Be careful, honey," his mother replied. "The snow is very deep." Outside, the cold air bit at Sam's face. He trudged through the knee-deep snow to Mrs. Parker's driveway. "Mrs. Parker, let me help you." The old woman looked up, her face red from the cold. "Oh, Sam, you're such a good boy. But you don't have to." "I want to," Sam insisted, taking the shovel from her hands. "Please go inside where it's warm. I'll clear the driveway for you." Mrs. Parker hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, dear. But please come in for hot chocolate when you're done. I made cookies too." As Sam shoveled the snow, he remembered how Mr. Parker used to help him build snowmen when he was little. The old couple had been like grandparents to him, always having cookies ready after school and Band-Aids for scraped knees. An hour later, the driveway was clear. Sam's arms ached, but he felt proud of his work. Inside Mrs. Parker's warm kitchen, the smell of chocolate chip cookies filled the air. "These are the best cookies ever," Sam said, taking a big bite. "Just like always." Mrs. Parker smiled sadly. "Frank used to love these cookies too." Her eyes filled with tears. "The house feels so empty without him." Sam looked around the cozy kitchen, noticing how quiet it was. Then he had an idea. "Mrs. Parker, would you teach me how to make these cookies?" Her face brightened. "You want to learn?" "Yes, and maybe you could tell me stories about when you and Mr. Parker were young?" That afternoon, Mrs. Parker taught Sam how to measure flour and cream butter with sugar. She told him stories about how she and Frank met at a dance in 1955 and how they built this house together. As they baked, Sam noticed Mrs. Parker seemed less sad. Her eyes sparkled as she shared her memories, and her laugh filled the kitchen just like before. When the new batch of cookies was done, Sam had another idea. "We should share these with other neighbors. The Thompson kids across the street love cookies." Mrs. Parker hesitated. "I haven't talked to many neighbors since Frank. I've been staying inside mostly." "We can go together," Sam suggested. "I'll help you walk through the snow." With cookies packed in containers, Sam and Mrs. Parker visited their neighbors. Everyone was happy to see Mrs. Parker out again, and the cookies brought smiles to cold, tired faces. The Thompson kids begged to learn how to bake cookies too. Soon, Mrs. Parker's kitchen became a gathering place. Every Wednesday after school, neighborhood children would come over to bake and listen to her stories. Sam kept his promise to help Mrs. Parker through the winter. He cleared her driveway after every snowfall and checked on her every day. But more importantly, he helped her find joy again. As winter turned to spring, Mrs. Parker's house was no longer quiet. The kitchen often echoed with children's laughter and the smell of fresh cookies. She started a cookbook filled with recipes and stories, which she planned to give to all her baking students. One day, as Sam helped her write down the secret ingredient for perfect snickerdoodles, Mrs. Parker said softly, "You know, Sam, when Frank passed away, I thought my happy days were over. But you showed me that there's always more love to give and receive." Sam smiled. "Mr. Parker once told me that promises made in winter are the strongest because they keep our hearts warm. I promised him I'd look after you, and I always will." Mrs. Parker hugged him tight. "Frank would be so proud of you, and I'm proud to have you as my honorary grandson." The winter that started with loneliness and grief had blossomed into something beautiful. A simple act of kindness had created a chain of friendship that warmed the whole neighborhood. Every Wednesday, the smell of cookies still drifts from Mrs. Parker's kitchen, and the sound of laughter fills her home. And Sam knows that some promises, like the ones made in the depths of winter, have the power to change lives forever.